Montana Territory, June 1883, the wind whipped hard against the white clapboard church on the edge of Clearwater, tossing dust and wildflowers alike across the steps where Vada Mae Monroe stood, her hand clutching the front of her wedding dress like it might tear away from her. Her limp was worse when she was nervous, and right now she could barely keep her balance. The crowd outside shifted uncomfortably. Some whispered, others just stared. Pastor Langley kept glancing down the dirt road, but no one was coming for her. Vada blinked against the sting in her eyes. Her fiancé, Elijah Carter, had ridden out of town an hour ago. Word had it he could not stand the thought of being shackled to a cripple. Her father, stiff and red-faced, tried to tug her back inside, but Vada shook her head. She would not hide. Not today. She stood there with her chin high, even as the world seemed to tilt under her. "You do not have to stay out here, honey," Mrs. Dobbins said gently, but Vada did not answer. She could not move. She could barely breathe. The church doors creaked open again behind her. More faces, more pity. Vada bit down hard on the inside of her cheek to keep from crying. Then out of the crowd, a tall man with dusty boots and a battered hat pushed forward. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, showing strong forearms, and his brown hair was unruly like he had not even tried to tame it for the occasion. His name was Zeke Jarrett. He was a broke farmer from the far side of Willow Creek, barely scraping by on a patch of stubborn land. Everyone knew Zeke. He was a quiet man, always working, always polite. No one ever thought he would marry. He had nothing to offer. But there he was now, walking straight up the steps toward her, his green eyes steady. "Miss Vada," he said, his voice low and rough from the dust. "You still willing to get married today?" For a second, she could not make sense of the words. She stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. You cannot mean that," she whispered, her lips trembling. He reached out and took her hand into his calloused one. Held it like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I mean it," Zeke said. "I do not care about a limp. You are the bravest woman I have ever seen." The crowd gasped. Mrs. Dobbins dropped her handkerchief. Pastor Langley looked like he might faint. Zeke squeezed her hand gently. "Say yes, Vada, please." Everything inside her screamed that this was madness, but the way he was looking at her steady, honest, kind undid something deep inside her chest. "Yes," she said, her voice cracking. The church doors opened wider and someone ushered them both inside. Vada barely remembered walking down the aisle, barely heard the pastor's words. She only knew that when Zeke slid a simple brass ring onto her finger, his hands were steady. He smiled at her like she was not broken at all. When they stepped out of the church, man and wife, the town was silent. Staring, Zeke tucked her hand into the crook of his arm like he was proud. He glanced down at her with a small, crooked grin. "Ready to shock the whole damn town," he murmured. Vada laughed, a sound that startled even herself. "I think we already did." They rode away together on an old bay horse, Vada perched in front of him, his arms around her. Her wedding dress was dusty, her heart was bruised, but when she leaned back against Zeke's chest, for the first time in her life, she felt safe. The ride to his farm took the better part of 2 hours. Zeke talked little, but he pointed out landmarks in old fallen oak, the stream that ran dry come August, the ridge where the hawks nested. He spoke like he was offering her pieces of his life, one by one. When they reached the farm, Vada saw it was even rougher than she imagined. A small cabin with a sagging porch, a barn barely standing, fields that looked more dust than crop. "I know it is not much," Zeke said, dismounting and helping her down carefully. "But it is yours now, too." Vada touched the porch post, feeling the rough wood under her fingers. It was not much. It was everything. Inside, the cabin was clean but bare. A table, 2 chairs, a bed covered in a faded quilt. Zeke fidgeted, looking suddenly nervous. "I can sleep in the barn if you want," he said quickly. "Until you are comfortable," she shook her head. "No, I married you, Zeke Jarrett. I aim to be your wife." His eyes darkened, something raw and grateful flashing across his face. He stepped closer, reaching up to touch her cheek with the back of his hand. "You are the bravest thing I ever saw," he said again, his voice thick. Vada leaned into his touch without thinking. She was so tired of being treated like something broken. Zeke looked at her like she was whole. That night they lay side by side under the worn quilt. Zeke held her gently, like he was afraid he might hurt her. Vada tucked her head under his chin, feeling his heartbeat strong against her ear. "You did not have to do this," she whispered into the dark. "I wanted to," he said simply. "I saw you standing there proud and alone, and I thought, if I could be the man to stand beside you, I would be the luckiest fool alive." Tears welled up in her eyes. She pressed closer to him, feeling his arms tighten around her. Outside, the wind howled across the empty fields, but inside the cabin, it was warm. For the first time in her life, Vada Mae Monroe Vada Mae Jarrett fell asleep knowing she was loved. Morning broke slow and golden across the hills, throwing long beams of light through the crooked window panes. Vada stirred beneath the quilt, her body sore from the long ride and the strain of yesterday, but her mind clear in a way it had not been in years. She turned her head and found Zeke already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, lacing up his boots. He noticed her movement and gave a small, almost shy nod. "I got to get the cows out to pasture," he said, voice low to keep the peace of the morning. "There's not much, but what grass we have they'll need." Vada pushed herself up slowly, careful not to jar her bad leg too much. "I can help," she offered. Zeke shook his head once, firm but not unkind. "You had enough burden yesterday. Rest a while, I'll show you the place proper when I get back." She watched him gather his hat and step outside, the door clicking shut behind him. Alone in the cabin, Vada pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and looked around with new eyes. A small cookstove sat cold in one corner, a handful of cracked plates stacked neatly on a shelf. A single battered trunk rested at the foot of the bed. The place spoke of a quiet life, honest and worn thin by hard seasons. It did not frighten her. She had known worse. She rose carefully and found a broom leaning against the wall. The floor needed sweeping. Dust clung to the corners and to the uneven boards, and though her leg ached, Vada set to work, slow and steady. She was not about to sit idle while Zeke worked himself ragged. By the time he returned, leading a small brown cow with a crooked horn, Vada had swept the entire cabin and set a pot of water to boil over a small fire she nursed on the stove. He paused in the doorway, eyebrows lifting slightly. "You did not have to," he said, stepping inside and wiping his boots carefully before crossing the threshold. "I wanted to," she replied, echoing the words he had given her yesterday. He set a tin pail of milk on the table. "There's a few chickens out back too. If you throw them some grain, they'll give us eggs come morning." Vada nodded, tucking the information away. She caught sight of a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth before he busied himself with the pail. Later, after they shared a breakfast of boiled oats and fresh milk, Zeke led her out to the porch. The June sun had warmed the earth, and the scent of wild sage filled the air. He motioned toward the fields stretching beyond the barn. "This land wasn't much even before the droughts hit, but I figure with enough work we can make it better. Maybe get a garden going." Vada leaned against the porch post, careful to balance her weight. "I know how to tend a garden," she said. "My mama taught me." Zeke's eyes lit with something like hope. "Then you already know more than me. I can plant, but keeping things alive's another story." "You plant too deep," he chuckled, a low sound that rumbled from his chest. "Seems I do everything too deep." She smiled, a real one, feeling it stretch her cheeks in a way they had not in too long. "Well," she said, "maybe between the two of us we'll figure it out." The afternoon stretched long. Zeke showed her the shed where he kept his tools, the lean-to where he stored winter wood. They walked the property, slow to match her pace, and he pointed out the best spot for a garden close to the well. As they passed the barn, Vada paused, catching sight of a small carving above the doorframe. A crude heart with two initials inside. "Yours?" she asked, touching it lightly. Zeke's face flushed under the brim of his hat. "Belonged to my folks. They built all this long before they passed." Something inside Vada softened. This land was not just stubborn soil and broken fences. It was memory, family, love planted deep and left to weather the years. That night, after washing the dust from their hands and faces, they sat by the hearth. Zeke worked on mending a harness, his fingers deft with the leather. Vada mended a tear in one of his shirts, the needle slipping steady through the cloth. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire. After a long while, Zeke set his work aside. He looked at her, serious. "I know this wasn't the wedding you deserved," he said, voice rough with feeling. "I can't promise you much, Vada, just hard work, honesty. And I'll do my damnedest to make you happy." Vada laid her sewing in her lap. The hurt from yesterday still lived somewhere inside her, but it no longer defined her. Not here, not with him. "I did not want fancy," she said, her voice steady. "I wanted someone who would stay." Zeke reached across the small space between them and took her hand, his grip warm and sure. "I'll stay," he said, and she believed him. The days unfolded gently, stitched together by small labors and quieter moments. By the end of the first week, Vada knew the sound of Zeke's boots on the porch boards, the way his voice dropped soft at night when he was tired, and that he always set aside the first bite of his supper for the old hound that wandered up from the creek most evenings. One late afternoon, after Zeke had finished bracing the barn's sagging door with salvaged wood, he found Vada kneeling in the garden plot, her skirts hiked above her ankles and her hands deep in the stubborn earth. "You are planting without rain coming?" he asked, resting his shoulder against the fence post. "I am planting hope," Vada said, brushing a strand of hair back with a dirt-smeared wrist. "Hope needs no rain to take root." Zeke watched her a moment, the wind tugging at the loose strands of her hair. "You think it'll grow?" She pressed her palm flat against the soil. "It has to." He crouched beside her, running his fingers through the dirt. "Might be you were meant for this land more than me." Vada smiled faintly and placed a handful of seeds in his palm. "Then plant some with me." They worked side by side until the sun dropped low, the sky streaked in purples and golds. Zeke's hands were clumsy at first, but he followed her lead, setting each seed with care. When they finished, they stood together, looking over the small, uneven rows. "Not much to look at now," he said. "It will be," she replied. "We just have to give it time." That evening, after supper, Zeke pulled an old fiddle from under the bed. Its varnish was cracked, and one string had been mended with a rough knot, but when he tucked it under his chin and drew the bow across, a soft, lilting tune filled the cabin. Vada looked up from the stitching she was mending. "I did not know you played," he shrugged, not meeting her eyes. "Mama taught me, said every man ought to know how to make music, even if only for himself." The melody wound through the room, tender and slow. Vada set her sewing aside, folding her hands in her lap. "Will you teach me?" she asked when he lowered the fiddle. Zeke hesitated, then nodded, his mouth lifting at one corner. "Might take patience." "I have plenty," she said. He held the fiddle out to her. She cradled it awkwardly, and he stepped behind her, guiding her fingers with his own. His touch was careful, always asking permission without needing words. The warmth of him at her back, the steadiness of his hands, sent a shiver down her spine. "Like this," he said quietly, adjusting the bow in her grasp. "Easy now." She coaxed a rough, wavering note from the strings. It was not beautiful, but Zeke grinned, his face lighting up with something more than pride. "See," he said, "you already got music in you." Vada laughed, the sound light and astonished in her own ears. She tried again, and the note came a little steadier. They stayed up late, long past when the fire burned low, passing the fiddle back and forth, fumbling through simple tunes and laughing over the worst of them. When they finally set the instrument aside, Zeke reached across the small space between them. "I don't know much about courting proper," he said, voice rough. "But if you let me, I'd like to learn with you." Vada placed her hand over his fingers closed around hers, warm and sure. "I would like that," she whispered. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not. Their lips met in a kiss as gentle and certain as a sunrise, a promise made without fanfare or fear. Outside, the night deepened, the stars scattering bright across the sky. Inside the cabin, two souls, battered but unbroken, began the slow work of weaving their lives together. Summer deepened its hold on the land, pressing warm and heavy against the hills. The earth cracked underfoot, and the creek behind the house thinned to a mean trickle. Vada rose early each day, her palms calloused from working the stubborn garden, her shoulders browned from the sun. One evening, after the chores were set aside and the last light bled from the sky, Zeke led her past the barn to a small stand of cottonwoods she hadn't noticed before. He carried a battered lantern, its flame throwing long shadows across the tall grass. "I got something to show you," he said, voice low, almost shy. Vada followed, brushing dry grass from her skirts. The trees opened onto a narrow clearing where a rough bench had been built from split logs. Beside it, tucked under a leaning cottonwood, was a patch of wild prairie roses, pink and stubborn against the dry earth. Zeke set the lantern on the bench and scratched the back of his neck. "I used to come here when things got too heavy. Thought maybe you'd like it too." Vada stepped closer to the roses, breathing in the faint, sweet scent. She ran her fingers lightly over one bloom, careful not to bruise the petals. "They are beautiful," she said. "They don't mind the hard ground," Zeke said. "They just keep blooming." Vada turned toward him, her chest tight with something she could not name. She reached out slowly, taking his rough hand in hers. "This place feels like a promise," she said. Zeke's thumb brushed over her knuckles, hesitant but sure. "Maybe it is." They sat together on the bench, the lantern flickering between them. Crickets sang in the tall grass, and the night air smelled of dry sage and dust. For a long while, neither spoke. Then Zeke shifted, pulling something small from his pocket. He held it out to her, a thin silver chain, finer than anything she had ever owned. At the end dangled a tiny locket, worn smooth with age. "It was my mama's," he said. "She always said when a man found someone worth holding on to, he ought to pass it on." Vada's throat tightened. She touched the locket with trembling fingers. "I can't take this," she whispered. "You can," Zeke said. "I want you to." He fastened it around her neck, his fingers brushing the nape of her neck. Vada closed her eyes, letting the warmth of his touch settle deep inside her. When she opened them, Zeke was watching her with an expression so open and steady it made her breath catch. "I never thought anyone would look at me the way you do," she said, voice thick. Zeke leaned closer, his forehead resting lightly against hers. "You're the strongest thing I ever laid eyes on." The lantern flickered between them, casting their shadows long and tangled across the ground. Vada pressed her hand to Zeke's chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "I want to build a life with you," she said, the words falling sure from her lips. "Not just survive it." Zeke's hand came to rest over hers. "Then we will." They stayed there until the stars thickened overhead, the prairie roses nodding in the warm night breeze. When they finally rose to leave, Vada glanced back once at the clearing, the bench, the flowers. It wasn't grand. It wasn't easy. But it was theirs. Hand in hand, they walked back to the little cabin, the lantern swinging between them, lighting the path ahead. By late summer, the garden had begun to show itself. The beans climbed thin poles Vada had fashioned from saplings, and a scatter of squash vines sprawled across the tilled patch like green rivers. Zeke built a stout fence from fallen timber to keep wandering deer out, his hands steady and sure as he worked in the dry heat. One afternoon, Vada sat under the cottonwoods, mending the strap of a worn satchel Zeke used for trips into Clearwater. She looked up when she heard his boots approach, followed by the hollow thud of a crate set down near the bench. "I traded 2 hens for these," he said, brushing dust from his sleeves. "Might have overpaid, but it felt right." Vada rose and knelt beside the crate. Inside, nestled in straw, were 3 young apple saplings, their slender trunks wrapped carefully in damp cloth. She traced a leaf with the tip of her finger. "They'll take years to bear." Zeke crouched beside her, the sun catching the green flecks in his eyes. "We'll be here." It was not a grand declaration, only a simple truth, but it filled the space between them like the warm hush of a summer evening. They chose a spot near the garden where the soil was softer from all the watering. Zeke showed her how to dig wide and deep, his shirt sticking to his back with sweat. Vada fetched water from the well, carrying it carefully with her bad leg braced firm beneath her. That night, as the stars fanned out overhead, Vada leaned against Zeke on the porch steps, their shoulders pressed together. The young trees stood silhouetted against the horizon, thin and hopeful. "I want to build more than just a farm here," Zeke said, his voice thoughtful. "I want a real life." "With you," Vada rested her head against his shoulder. "You already are." Fall came early that year, the mornings sharp with frost. Vada quilted a new blanket from scraps she traded for in town, piecing it together by the fire while Zeke repaired the barn roof against the coming snows. They worked side by side, not needing to fill every hour with words. One evening, while Vada stirred a pot of stew, Zeke set down a flat bundle wrapped in brown cloth beside her. "I got you something last time I went in for nails," he said. She wiped her hands on her apron and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a book, thick and worn at the edges, the title faded but still legible, Wildflowers of the Western States. Vada turned the pages slowly, her fingers trembling a little. Each illustration was hand-colored, the names written in looping script. "I thought," Zeke said, clearing his throat, "you might like to know the names of the ones growing out by the creek." She closed the book and clutched it to her chest, blinking hard against the sudden sting in her eyes. "It's the finest gift I've ever been given." Zeke's ears turned pink, and he busied himself with ladling stew into bowls. They ate by the fire, steam rising from their bowls, the book resting safely on the side table. Afterward, Zeke fetched the fiddle, tuning it carefully while Vada leaned back in the rocking chair he had built for her from willow branches. He played a slow, lilting tune she had not heard before, something sweet and a little sad. She closed her eyes, letting the music settle into the worn places inside her. When he finished, he set the fiddle aside and crossed the room, kneeling before her. He took her hands in his, rough against smooth, and looked up at her with a quiet certainty. "I don't want to just be your husband by law, Vada," he said. "I want to be your partner in every breath, every season, for as long as we're given." She cupped his face between her palms, feeling the coarse stubble beneath her fingers. "You already are," she whispered. He rose then and kissed her, slow and deep, the kind of kiss that bound two souls closer than any preacher's words could. She held on to him, feeling the strength of his arms, the steadiness of his heart, and the fierce tenderness he offered without ever needing to speak it. The snow came early that year, blanketing the fields and softening the hard edges of the land. Vada and Zeke spent the long winter nights by the fire, reading from the Wildflower book, planting dreams between the pages. They talked quietly of the orchard they would tend, the chickens they would raise, the children they hoped would one day fill the cabin with laughter. In the spring, the apple trees budded, small and delicate against the warming sky. Years later, travelers passing through Clearwater would sometimes stop to stare at the little farm where the orchard grew thick and strong, the garden bursting with color, and the cottonwoods standing tall over a well-tended cabin. They would ask about the couple who lived there, the man with the quiet eyes and the woman with the proud step, and the townsfolk would smile and say, "That's the Jarrett place." Built on nothing but hard ground and love. Inside the cabin, beneath the patchwork quilt stitched by steady hands, Zeke and Vada Jarrett would fall asleep each night with the peace of those who had weathered every storm and found in each other the home they had searched for all their lives.